Okay.
Do you want me to get this one as well?
I can take it out of that if you want. You probably there might be a glare.
Oh, wow. What year do you think this is from? Do you know?
It is my cousin Bernard. With his parents. He's the little boy. He died a few years ago, just before his 100th birthday.
Oh my God. Is he the?
He's
Is
the
he
baby.
in on the man's lap, or on the little boy Stacy?
So that would be about the 1920s.
Yeah, he's the baby on the lap.
Oh.
Yeah,
Oh
he's the lap baby.
That is so cute. Yeah, we look at them and we see old-timey images, but back in the day, they were like, oh, that's my little baby with his chubby cheeks, with his...
Yeah, these are.
Of course, everyone looking very serious.
Do you want me to hold that up to the camera, Miss Deborah?
Yeah.
Is he in the image? Is he the guy in the front? Excellent. Well, are you ready to start?
Whenever you are, yes.
Okay. Would you mind stating your full name and spelling it for the record?
My name is Courtney Lynn Cannon Scott, Courtney, middle initial L, or we could spell it out, Lynn, Lynn.
Okay.
Cannon, Cannon is my maiden name, and married name is Scott, Scott.
Okay. And then for the record, it is June 26th, and we're here for the Underground Railroad project with the National Park Service. I had to add that in there.
All right.
Introduce ourselves.
I'm the person speaking. I am Gabrielle Hurd, and then I'm here with
Ronan Hart.
And
Helio Alves. And BarryJurgensen.
excellent. Would you mind saying your the date and your place of birth? What your birthday is?
I was born November 4th, 1948, in Mount Vernon, Knox County, Ohio.
Okay. Ohio native. Ohio.
Yes, I'm a Buckeye.
So talk about your family when you were growing up. What did they, what ethnicity did they identify as? What did they consider themselves?
We're African American, and my mom's family was from Mount Vernon. My dad was born in Alabama, but the family moved to Oberlin in the mid-1920s. I think it was 1926. My Aunt Chloelle, who I used to spend summers with in Oberlin, told me that they took the train to Wellington, and then they took the streetcar from Wellington to Oberlin. And they lived on Groveland until they bought property and had a house put up. So I spent my time between Mount Vernon and Oberlin. Growing up, it was, have a lot of cousins on both sides. There was a difference in the families, but both were based on faith. being together as a family, and on education. Those three things. And that's all of my cousins, everybody. That's sort of been the through line for everything.
Speaking of that, how was religion a part of your life growing up? Was it, you know, in your daily life? Did your family go to church every Sunday? And what denomination are they?
It was AME, African Methodist Episcopal, in Mount Vernon. We went to the Wayman AME Chapel in Mount Vernon. I think they just got a historic marker not long ago. And that was where my mom's family grew up. Here in Oberlin, my dad's family went to Mount Zion. And I think I have some old Mount Zion booklets. I don't think they're that old, but I have his baptism certificate where he went to Sunday school. So church played a very important part. And it was either AME in Mount Vernon, Mount Zion Baptist, and then when, as I was growing up and the family eventually we moved to Connecticut. My dad got a job at Pratt & Whitney Aircraft, and we attended Dixwell Congregational Church. So there's always been a church that we went to all the time, every Sunday. It was just a routine. You could almost set your clock by the routine that we had, and church was a big part of that.
What do you think? How do you think church influenced your thoughts on your personal identity and your family's identities growing up?
I think that it's really the basis for how I do and what I do. It's a faith-based kind of life I live. A lot of times people will say they would like to find their family. For instance, they would like to find their family history. And they say, well, how much will it cost? And for a long time, I did not even charge. I said, well, if you're family, quote unquote family, then I need this for practice. And so I have traced all of the spouses for each of my first cousins on both sides of my family. And the church I attended, let me back up a little bit. Growing up, we lived in Cleveland for a while. I went to grade school in Cleveland, but we moved to Connecticut, and then I went to middle school and high school in Connecticut, and we attended church there, and then Massachusetts. So let me think. Say the question again.
Yeah, I'm just interested in how going to church affected your identity and how you view yourself and how that informs who you are today.
Okay, I think it is, I cannot quote Bible verses, but I remember a lot just from being in church so much. So I couldn't tell you what book it's in or what line or scripture, but I remember it. I've got the little lace gloves that I wore when I was a little girl, 6 years old, going to church. The little Bible study cards we got at Sunday school. I've still got some of those. So church played a big part. And a lot of things I do for my family and then for the church family with whatever church I go to. The church I belonged to in Georgia, when I lived in Georgia, was Mount Zion Baptist Church. I started a heritage ministry to help people learn how to trace their family history, because that church had, it wasn't Mount Zion, it was Shiloh Baptist Church in McDonough, Georgia. And they started a heritage ministry, and that was very popular. So church played a big part.
Was a history of enslavement or slavery discussed in church or at home at that time? Was it a place to discuss that history?
No,
No.
it was not.
Okay.
In fact, in school, history was my worst subject. I wish they had Google. I would have been an A student, but I did not like history. I started liking it more when it became personal. After I started looking up information about my family, then I wanted to know more. Well, where did they live? Where did they get their food? How much did things cost? What did they have a garden? And then I started talking to some of my older relatives. And on both my mom's side and my dad's side, the oldest relative, I asked them, can you tell me about what it was like growing up and what you remember about your grandparents? And so I have a written record from both my mom's side of the family and my dad's side in their own handwriting. And in both instances, my aunt said, it was written down, that it was sad during slavery, but the parents didn't talk to their children about it. And so history, enslavement, Civil War, U.S. history in that area was not a subject of conversation in any of our houses. I didn't start learning about my own heritage until my dad passed in the mid-90s, and I started looking up information.
Well, that definitely answers my question about how you became interested in genealogy as an adult. Do you remember making any discoveries about your family history as a kid that made you put it into your mind that you'd be interested in studying personal histories in the future?
I like personal histories just because a lot of it is just funny. There are some sad things. And I have, in the process of looking for information, have come across incidents or books that I had to kind of just step back because it was just too sad. And I would be crying, literally crying. And I just couldn't, I had to just step away. But that said, sometimes in talking with my older relatives, they would be talking about old times or have old phrases that would come up in conversation, and they would talk about things that happened when they were little. One of my favorite cousins, Reverend Mayle, who is the baby in this picture, his grandfather was Sam Sharp. And Sam Sharp was Tower Adams' grandson. And so my cousin Bernard, let's say his son told me that Bernard used to go to the trolley stop and wait for the trolley with some other young friends of his, because when the ladies got off, they could see their ankles. And that was a big deal. Let's go down to the trolley's coming. And Bernard told me that when he used to go to Upper Sandusky as a boy, they would, from Mount Vernon, they would put him on the train. And he said it was, I can't remember the name of it, but he said by the time he got there, he was covered with soot because it was open windows in the coal car. And he stayed with his grandfather, Sam Sharp, who had a gun shop in Upper Sandusky and gun and bicycle shop. And there was a bar nearby. And Bernard told me that at night he could hear guys fighting in the alley, and he would just turn over and go back to sleep. And he would get up early because when they fought, their money fell out of their pockets. So he would be the first to go downstairs and get the money off of the ground. And then they would take a wagon and go I can't remember where. I've got it written down someplace. But they would get a bag of peanuts. They would go take the wagon and get peanuts. So it was interesting hearing about a long time ago from random relatives on my mom or my dad's side. But I wasn't interested in finding out anymore at that time. Like I said, it wasn't until after my dad passed away. And my mom said, one thing your dad always wanted to know was more about his family. And I thought, I'll do it. I'll look it up. Look up a couple things. And here I am over 20 years later, and I still haven't found everything I want.
How do you think discovering family history is empowering? Do you ever have discovering your family history made you feel more sure of yourself in your life?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think sometimes there's absolutely no way, I don't think I could have survived. But knowing that my ancestors who didn't have access to all the things I do, they survived, they thrived, and they left a record of what they did. And once you know how to look and what to look for, like names that are repeated, a child is named after an aunt or an uncle or a parent. And so names are usually repeated in families. And in some ways, that's how you can know you're with the right family. My dad's family, the surname was Cannon. And probably I think it was last year when I actually found the slave owners. And two of the names in the family were Phyllis and Sabe, S-A-B-E. And those names repeat in different generations. So I know I have the right family. And Cannon was spelled early on by the slave owner with a K instead of a C, but it sounded the same, which is one thing that I think some people get discouraged when they start doing research because they say, oh, that's not how we spell our name. But you have to, I started out researching using the sound deck, so you can't go by how something is spelled. You have to listen to how it sounds, and then you have to understand that different people in different areas had different voice patterns and, inflections in how they talked. But it's fascinating.
I'm really interested in what you're just discussing, like these nuances of trying to do this genealogy, and especially trying to do the genealogy of, for yourself, for an African-American family or for other African-American individuals who have maybe fewer written records going back further. That's something I've heard discussed as a part of this project, that that kind of genealogy is harder to do. So maybe what are the challenges in that, and how do you approach trying to do that genealogy?
There are records, you just have to know where to look. It may be church records, it might be employment records or military records, and it could be prison records, because once slavery ended, there were other ways to get free work. And there was a prison system. Work records, military records, prison records, birth certificates, death certificates, land records is really good. The people that bought land, sometimes you'll hear that the courthouse burned down and all the records were burned. But if someone owned property, they usually had a deed and they would bring it back because they wouldn't be able to sell it or do anything unless they proved that they owned it. So land records are probably one of the best resources if a family had property.
Talking about that, if, say, an African-American person wanted to do their family history, what was the process you would take to begin that?
The first thing I would ask them is to write down their name, the names of their parents, and their parents, brothers and sisters. And if they knew their grandparents, write that down. And if they didn't know the birth date, that's okay. But if they knew where they were born, that's a big help. And if they didn't know the name of the parent, maybe they lived with an aunt or an uncle or a cousin, then we want that information about them. What was that person's name? Where did they live? Where did they work? What did they do? So if you can't find the family member, you look for collateral family members, and then eventually it comes together. And I found out that there's an amazing number of links in my family history to others in United States and Ohio history. It is just unbelievable. I am fascinated, and I'm the one that's doing it. But when you consider how African Americans came to this country and the areas that they mostly were in, it is not surprising to me that there's so much interconnectedness. It's like a puzzle. And every time I find another piece, the picture gets a little clearer.
That's amazing. Going back a little bit, I want to talk about the Underground Railroad, but I want to also come back to talking about genealogy as well.
Okay.
What is your connection to the Underground Railroad, and how have you discovered that through doing genealogy?
When I started tracing my dad's family, I used the census records, and it was before I had access to computers. So at that time, I was living in Georgia, and I was going to the National Archives, and I was using the sound decks and looking things up. And I think I started with the 1930 census. And I've even got the big printouts from there, which now I can look it up online, and it's a lot easier to read. But what I found was I started with my dad's family. He was born in Shady Grove, Alabama. He never had a birth certificate. My Aunt Chloe, his older sister, had signed a certificate vouching that this is who he says he is and this is when he was born. But I think there may be a birth certificate, but it might be in Pike County instead of Montgomery County. So that's one thing you have to be aware of when you are researching. You have to know the neighboring counties. I have a map book. History was not my strong point. So I have a map book so I can look things up and see where people lived, what state and county was next to it. But what I did was I started with the 1930 census, and I worked backwards in time to 1920, 1910, 1900. And I knew my dad's parents and who he married, so I could look up the families. And I actually found the cemetery where my dad's family is buried in Shady Rock Elvie Baptist Church in Shady Grove, Alabama. I wrote to the pastor, but at the time, it was an itinerant pastor, and he only came through once every 2 or 3 months. But he did send me a letter saying that there would be church records and that there are probably still people living in Shady Grove that know the family. I have been back a couple times, but haven't had a chance to go to the church to follow up on that. But that said, as I researched my dad's family, got a lot of that information, my mom said, well, what about my family? You're finding all this out about your dad. What about me? What about my family? So I started looking up my mom's family, and that's where I found the Underground Railroad connection. My mom's dad was Earl Sharp, and Earl Sharp's father was Samuel Alexander Sharp, and that's who was born in the 1840s in Washington, Pennsylvania, and lived with his grandfather and his sisters in Canonsburg for the most part, but Washington County, Pennsylvania. And so as I was looking up information and going back further, to see how much information I could find out about what things were like in Pennsylvania. I think it's not far from where we're at, maybe an hour and a half drive, which goes into geography and history again. It's a trial for me. But I found this book, Brady, was mentioned, and it was about a guy named Tower Adams, and it spoke about him as a imaginary figure. But when I looked up the information, there actually was a Tower Adams. He was not imaginary, and he was my great-grandfather's grandfather. And that's how I started learning about the Underground Railroad. It was in the 1990s. So that was what started it all.
Can you repeat your relative's name who was mentioned in this book?
Tar Adams.
Tar Adams.
Tower. It was Tower Adams, but he would also go by Tar, T-A-R. And in the process of doing my research, I met a lady online who was also researching in neighboring Greene County as well as Washington County. And so she has helped me a lot. And she said some of her Adams ancestors were conductors in Greene County for the Underground Railroad. And so we've talked about that, and she's helped me a lot. She actually lives in Vashon, Washington, and we email and text on Messenger at least a couple times a week. And she's helped me find some new information about Tower Adams, and then we both like animals, so we have a lot in common. And we think maybe one day we'll meet in Washington, Pennsylvania.
That sounds like a fun meetup, yeah.
I think so. Can't wait.
So tell me about Tar Adams. What was his role on the Underground Railroad?
He was a conductor. There is some history that say he may have been involved in a murder. There's writing about him being an excellent rifleman. And I actually, some of the people that have written this, I've been in touch with them and have the book. So I've got a lot of things I've been, reading about, background material. And even stayed in touch with the people at the Genealogy Society in Washington, Pennsylvania for help in looking things up. And hopefully that is, I think, one of the things I want to do this summer. I want to actually go and look at the archives. I think a couple of years ago, they said I could have someone do it. I think it was $20 an hour. Back then, it's probably more than that now. But the thing is, I know all of the names. And so I think it would be better if I go. And because I may see a name and say, oh yeah, I remember that. I might not remember exactly where, but it's in my file. So that's the next step. So
you didn't grow up hearing about Tar Adams. You found him through genealogy?
I found him through genealogy. And I found him by mistake and read the book and then bought 2 copies so I could send one to my mom. And so I have her copies still.
That's an amazing story that you just found him through coincidence like that.
Yeah, it's just by accident. And I found so many other interesting things about him and the rest of the family. And I think that his actions and helping others get to safety, it kind of carried over. And the family didn't really talk about it, but they were a close-knit family and everybody helped each other.
Now, why do you think they didn't talk about it? Do you think they didn't to protect him because it would have been dangerous to act as a conductor?
Yes.
What do you think?
I think it would. that was the main reason. I think you don't know a lot about who was a conductor. You may hear stories about it. There's actually another relative that is said to have been a conductor on the Underground Railroad, and that's Pleasant Litchford. Someone has written a book about him not long ago, and he was in Upper Arlington. And the thing is, it says he is, but there's no real proof. But that's what you hear for a lot of other people that were conductors on the Underground Railroad. There's nothing written down. It's oral history, and then just putting the pieces together and see if it makes a logical story.
Yeah, there's so much hidden about conductors on the Underground Railroad, and we're so happy we get to talk to you about it. But,
I love talking about it. My kids are bored. Mom, please, you've told us that.
So, well, we want to hear what you've been telling your kids. So, where did he operate out? You said it was Pennsylvania.
It was Western Pennsylvania, Washington County.
Okay.
And I don't know if he was born in Maryland or Virginia, but I have to look at the maps because borders change. So it could have been Maryland one year, and then the borders changed, and then that what used to be Maryland became Virginia. So I don't know exactly where he was born.
I apologize.
That area.
Do you know if he was born a freedman or was he born enslaved?
I don't know.
Okay.
In talking with my online research friend for Washington and Greene County, she said that it's possible his name was Towers Adam or Adams Tower. So I don't know. I don't know. It's still a mystery.
We'll find out one day. We're going to find out.
I hope so.
So do you know how many people he assisted through the Underground Railroad, or is that information still hidden?
That information is still hidden.
Okay.
The book Brady, it says it's an imaginary story, but it's based on fact, because the people that are talked about in the story, the Mintons, that was a real family, and the other names in the book are real. So the fact that the author says that Tower Adams was a fictional character may have been in keeping secret what had been secret for so long.
Have you ever met this author, Jean Fritz?
No.
We need to find her.
No, I was going to write her a letter and say I did not think that was very nice, because Tower Adams was my great-great-grandfather, and he's not imaginary, he's a real person. But I was already on to the next adventure.
So how do you think discovering about Tower Adams changed your perception of your family? Do you think, you said, your family hid this history a lot because they needed to protect Tower Adams? Do you see any, down the generations, remnants of their desire to protect their other relatives?
Yeah.
Yeah.
When my dad was the only one of 11 children that finished high school, and then he went away to college. There is still some animosity in family because he left, but he didn't really leave. He still took care of family, helped and paid, paid tax bills on the family property, things like that. So, but people didn't really talk about why they did or what they did, but there was a focus on education and doing better and making sure your children were educated. I think that is probably the most important thing with church and family, faith and education. That's it. If you don't have that, then you're just kind of lost. I've talked to my brother and other friends. I thank God every day for being born into a great family that made sure did my homework, and the education, that's it.
When you found out about Tar Adams, how did it make you personally feel? Like, what was your initial reaction to finding this out? And then how has that changed over the time since you've discovered it?
I was actually excited. If I could dance, I probably would have danced. My kids said, "Mom, if you go dancing, don't tell anyone we're your kids, because you know you don't have any rhythm." So I was excited. And every time I think about how someone I'm related to so long ago did something so dangerous to help someone else, it just is encouragement that, oh man, I don't know, how am I going to do this? And it's encouraging for me to know that things are not really as bad as I think they are. I'm going to make it through. And so it was encouragement. And it's kind of like a good role model on doing the right thing. And maybe it doesn't pay off or work out, but down the road, it's going to make a big difference. So I think it's important.
So in addition to Tower Adams, the other ancestor that you mentioned was Sam Sharp. Was he a relative of Adams or unrelated? Or?
Sam Sharp was Sam Sharp was the grandson of Tower Adams.
I see.
And Sam Sharp was born, I don't remember the exact year, but it was in the 1840s. And a year later, his sister Jane was born, and then and a year after that, Anne. And what to me was interesting is that all of them lived in the household, and on their death certificates, Sam Sharp, Anne stayed in Pennsylvania. And she married a man, I think his name was William Dungy, Dungy. And on her death certificate, and on his sister Jane, who sometimes people in our family called Aunt Jenny, they said she was mean, but she was also an usher at the church. So I don't know how that balances out. But on her death certificate and on Sam Sharp's death, they were siblings, and they all listed the same mother and the same father, but I've never been able to find the father. Mm-hmm. And he's listed on their death certificates as Marsh or Mart Sharp. I have no idea, was he from Pennsylvania? Was he someone that came through every year? And that's why, all the kids have him. The kids evidently stayed in touch, because Anne stayed in Pennsylvania, but Sam and Jenny ended up in Ohio. So they stayed in touch. Mm-hmm. Strange. Another mystery.
You said your family was also engaged in social justice. You said your parents founded a community to engage in social justice. Can you tell me about that?
When I was going through my grandmother's pictures and albums, there was a picture of a group of people, and they were all dressed nicely, and it looked like it was in the 1940s. I recognized my mom and dad, but I didn't know, and I recognized one other person. It was my dad's friend, Matt, who used to cut his hair, and we all called him Uncle Matt. And I stayed in touch with him until he passed away. But I didn't really know what the context of that picture was. There was, on the back of the picture, there was a photographer's stamp. And so I Googled the name, and it turns out it was a famous African-American photographer who went to Ohio University. I thought, okay, maybe he was my dad's friend. And so I ordered the yearbook for Ohio University off of eBay. And when I got it, the picture that I had the original of was in the yearbook. And it had the names of all the people. And it was a group in the 1940s called Los Amigos that was started by African American students to help integrate the city of Athens and the school, because there was a popular hotel and restaurant in Athens. It was owned by a Black person, but if you were Black, you could not eat there. So I had no idea my dad was involved in social and civil rights when he got out of the military. He had gotten a Purple Heart in the Army. One of my cousins here gave me the article his mother had saved that told that he had, got a Purple Heart. So that's how I found out about my dad. And then in the archives at Ohio University online, it had the list of all the people in the group. My dad was the organizer and one of the founding members. Had no idea. That same year, my mom, there were pictures of my mom and her sisters in bathing suits in the 1940s. Turns out they made the front page in Knox County for being 5 sisters in the same family that all were finalists in the 1947 Miss Bronze Ohio.
Oh my God.
So I've got pictures of my mom and dad in the backyard at my grandparents' house in Mount Vernon. She's got the same swimsuit on. I had no idea. And I don't know who took the pictures, but I've got a lot of originals that is just amazing to me. I keep finding things when I'm not looking for it, and it's an amazing picture that's coming together. I'm not exactly sure what it is yet.
Well, I definitely have some questions to ask you about that. So where did he fight? Where did your dad fight?
He was in Germany, and he was following in the footsteps of, Sam Sharp and Sam's other sons, and my mom's dad, Earl. My mom's dad, Earl Sharp, fought in World War I. And he actually was injured at the Meuse-Argonne battle in France. I had no idea. My grandmother saved his original records that show he was injured, where he was at, and he brought back probably about 50 original postcards. New, nobody wrote on them, different scenes of cities in France during the war. And so I asked my brother, because, history was not my strong point. So I asked my brother, what could he tell me about the war? He said, look it up. Sound just like my dad. So I looked it up, which was probably better because now I remember it. But my dad, my mom's dad was at the Meuse-Argonne battle that ended World War I. And my dad got a Purple Heart in World War II.
That's amazing. That's so amazing. I wish we could talk to him as well.
There is actually another link to that that's even more unbelievable.
Oh, tell us, please.
While I was doing speaking engagements at different places and writing articles for the newspaper, I got an opportunity to meet Gayle King. And that's when my dad had passed away and my mom was living in Connecticut. And I met Gayle King. We had lunch together at the Hartford Club. And she was interested in family history, enjoyed reading my articles in the Black press. So that was really interesting. So we had a good lunch and I really didn't think any more of it. A couple of years ago, Henry Louis Gates did a show about Gayle King and her ancestry. And towards the end of the show, he said, well, we found some information about your grandfather, George Beauregard King. It turns out he was a medic in World War I at the Meuse-Argonne battle where my grandfather was injured. I'm not related to Gayle King, but our grandfathers probably interacted. I think that is just amazing.
That's amazing that he could have helped your grandfather.
Yes.
He could have been his medic. That's
Yes.
amazing. That's such a special connection to find.
When I was talking with one of my cousins, and was going over all of this, because I talk about it all the time. And my cousin Rocky said, well, my grandfather was at that same battle. I said, no. So I keep finding more information. And I didn't really find out a lot about Gayle King's grandfather, but I looked him up to see if I could find more information. Turns out he was born in Alabama, and his family lived on the same road as my dad's in Shady Grove, Pike County, Alabama. I am just amazed at the connection.
That's so beautiful that you found
everything
Gayle King
yeah. It just proves that we're all one family. Mm-hmm. We're all connected. We just don't always know how.
I want to go back to the your dad in his organization. Can you repeat the name of the organization?
Los Amigos. LOSAMIGOS.
So you said they work to integrate a hotel and a restaurant?
The City of Athens and Ohio University.
Okay.
To make it better for students of color. It was in the 1940s. My dad had, just got out of the military. The following year, in 1947, they got, he and my mom got married, and I was born in 1948. So he was wanting to make things better. He was a sharpshooter. My grandfather, my mom's dad, he was also a sharpshooter when he was in World War I. And but Tower Adams was he was a gunsmith and Underground Railroad conductor, and his sons and their children were sharpshooters and excellent riflemen. So it's interesting how things get passed down.
That's amazing. I'm conflicted. I don't know whether I want to ask you more about Los Amigos, or now that I know that Tar Adams was also a gunsmith. Which one do you want to go into more detail about first?
I think that
because we want to know what their jobs were. We'd love to know where they lived. We want to know everything about these people.
What's really interesting to me is that Tar Adams lived in some of the books I've read say he lived on Chestnut Street, west of First in Canonsburg, Pennsylvania, Washington County. And my grandparents in Mount Vernon lived on West Chestnut Street. Mm-hmm. So that just was fascinating to me. And there's just so many connections with people of color in the family who, I guess, stepped out of their comfort zone to help others. My grandmother, Sam Sharp's son, Earl, is my grandfather. He married Lillian Walker. Lillian Walker's family originated in West Virginia.
Okay.
And her mother was one of the first graduates of Storer College. So you see family, faith, education, it's repeated. And so they say opposites attract, but likes attract too. Mm-hmm. And so you have a community coming together to look out for one another and to pay it forward so their children have a better life. My cousin Bernard, whose mother was Mabel, and that was Sam Sharp's, one of his children too. his grandchildren. And my cousin Dorothy asked him why he was ashamed of her when they were growing up. And this would have been in the 1920s, 1930s in Mount Vernon. And she said, you would walk me home from school, but we always went in the alley. Why didn't we go through town? She said, are you ashamed of me? And he said, I'm darker than you. She looked like she was Caucasian. He said, if we had gone through town, the Klan would have had a problem. He said, I couldn't go through town, but I wanted you to be safe. That's why we went through the alley. So there's a backstory to a lot of how our parents lived and what they dealt with when they were growing up. And I think they just didn't talk about it because they were trying to protect us. I used to think my dad was angry at me all the time because he would always find fault with everything I did. At least I thought so. And he was an analytical scientist and loved math, spoke German, and I hated math. And he said he did not understand that. It was an exact science. You always are going to have an answer, but I didn't like it. But that said, my brother mentioned, he said, sis, Dad was trying to protect you in everything he did. And I had not looked at it like that. But every place we lived, we usually lived in an all-white neighborhood when we lived in Massachusetts and Connecticut. And the house was not on a main street. It was in a rural area. And it set a little bit back from the road, but you couldn't tell who lived there. And it did not occur to me until my brother mentioned that there was a reason he did everything, and it was always well thought out. And that's because that's what he learned from both sides of the family.
You know, now that you have this deeper understanding about your family and the reason they do these things to protect you and your relatives, how do you pass this knowledge down to your children, your nieces and nephews, your grandchildren, if you have grandchildren? What do you do to pass that down?
When I first started finding out information, I started talking to people about the amazing things I had found. And they said, well, you should write about that. And so writing a couple articles here and there for local newspapers or magazine turned into having a syndicated column that the Black press distributed nationwide. And so I got a P.O. box, and I was helping a lot of people. The thing is, most of my mail was from prisoners. I have probably still a tote full of letters that I answered because I kept a copy of the answers from prisons across the United States who the newspapers would be passed out to the prisons, and they would read my article and they would write and ask me. They said, you know, they're in prison, and the letters have the stamp on them from every prison in the United States. And they said, you know, but I would like my children to know about my history. Can you help me? So a lot of what I did in doing the research was look that up. I answered the questions. I did not get paid for this. So I'm kind of paying it forward because it's what I'm supposed to do. Mm. I've got to share the information so someone else can take it and they can tell their kids. That said, I've got 4 children, and they're all married. I have 8 grandchildren and 8 grand animals. We won't go into that. But I've gotten the spouses of each of my children interested in their family history, and they've kind of taken it and run with it. So when I'm able, I try to get people interested either in a church project or with their family, and that's what I love to do.
So that's beautiful. You're not just sharing materials, you're sharing the practice of studying genealogy for your your sons and daughters-in-law to teach to their grandchildren, their children.
Correct.
That's amazing.
Right.
That's definitely the most effective way, I think, to pass it down.
I think so. I was one of the founders for the Atlanta branch of the African American Genealogy and History, and but got sick and couldn't finish it out. But if you look at the history on the website, my name is listed as one of the founders, and nobody knows what happened to me. But that said, I think it's important to pay it forward and be involved with the community and the church, not just the community, but the church family, because knowledge is something you need it.
Can you tell me about the column you wrote? You wrote a column about genealogy for the Black press, you said?
It's called Back in the Day, Your History. And back in the day, and then dash your with a small letter Y, but a capital O for your history, because your history as a person is part of our history as a country. And so back in the day, our history, it ran for several years in the Black press nationwide. And then I did different speaking engagements. One of my first speaking engagements was a Network to Freedom event in St. Louis. So I've always kind of been tied to the Underground Railroad, but I didn't know why. And so I put together, and I think I sent it to Barry, an overview of my family, all its historic connections. It's called Still on the Train, but on the Right Track. And it kind of sums up what I'm doing, trying to share the information, get other people interested. I'm not getting paid. I do this because I love it. And scouting troops usually need their heritage badge. Senior citizens, great audience. They love to do stuff, but sometimes they don't have a computer, don't have a smartphone, but you can still trace family history the same way. Go to the library, a lot of free resources. So there's ways to do it. I like helping people. I raised my children as a nurse. That's why I write everything down.
That's amazing.
It comes in handy.
Let's see. I want to step back. So Tar Adams was a gunsmith. I can't leave that. I can't leave that stone unturned before we leave.
Yes. Bicycle shop.
That's also a connection.
Right. There is actually this notebook, I think. On the front, it actually has a little bit about his story, but Tower Adams was a gunsmith, and he was a gunsmith in Washington County. His grandson, Sam Sharp, had a bicycle and gun shop in Upper Sandusky. Probably did not leave Pennsylvania until his grandfather died. In the 1870 census, Tower Adams was in his 80s. And it was a few years later, I think in 1877, and Sam Sharp shows up in Upper Sandusky, or in Wyandotte County, Ohio. So I don't think he came to Ohio until his grandfather had died, but he probably had the tools that Tower Adams had. And I remember one of my cousins saying that someone had brought in a gun to be repaired to Sam Sharp. And one of my cousins when he was little. And it was my cousin Bernard. He said he was there when the man brought the gun in. And Sam Sharp looked at it and told him it would be a week and he could come back and get it, told him how much it would be. And then after the man left, Sam Sharp, within about 5 minutes, had fixed it and put the gun on the shelf. And my cousin Bernard said he asked his grandfather, well, why didn't you just fix it then? And he said he wouldn't have appreciated it. He said he would not have he wouldn't have wanted to pay me because it would have been too easy.
Yeah.
So it's just an interesting story about how people looked at life, and even it's just interesting.
You mentioned the history of military service, but I'm curious about if it goes back any further with these relatives, if you know maybe what they were doing during the Civil War. Because I'm sure if you were an Underground Railroad connector or conductor, that became pretty relevant when suddenly that was, the war that was taking over the whole country.
I actually do have a connection earlier in history, but it's not, I don't think, with the Underground Railroad, but I'm not sure. My grandmother, my mom's mother, her mother was the first graduate Astorer. She married William Walker. And her sister Blanche my grandmother's sister Blanche wrote down the family history, who the grandparents were, and so on. And so my Aunt Blanche said that their grandfather, James William Walker, was a Cherokee Indian.
Just to clarify, can you repeat the connection between Tar Adams, and this individual you're describing on your mom's side?
On my mom's side, my grandparent, Lillian Walker Sharp, and Earl Sharp. Earl Sharp was Sam Sharp's grandson. And so Lillian's mother was a graduate of Storer College. She was, the National Park Service sent me information and verified that she was in the first graduating class in 1890s. And her husband-to-be signed her autograph book. That said, my grandmother's sister told me that their grandfather was Cherokee Indian. And so as I was looking up other information about the Underground Railroad and trying to find out who people were that I had letters or cards from, I found the name James William Walker, and there was a link to the congressional record. And evidently, in the congressional record, I don't think I brought it with me, but there was a James Walker, Cherokee Indian, that got a congressional commendation for helping to open new territory for U.S. mail service. So I have written to the post office and verified this information, found out the routes that were taken, the trains, the cities, and it does say James Walker, Cherokee Indian, and this is the arrowhead that my Aunt Blanche gave me.
Do you mind if I hold that up to the camera?
Yeah, I can take it out.
So that's amazing. Rather than
it's
not military service, but really civil service he's Lewis and Clark to the post office.
I mean, how is this? I was teasing my brother. I said, you know what? We're like the Black Leave It to Beaver family. We have all of this interesting stuff going on, and we didn't know any of it.
There's so much hidden in every family's history. You're right.
But everyone has this. You just have to look for it. And I think one of the things that I'm hoping is that other people will say, wow, I wonder what's going on in my family, or what can I find? Because the information's there. You just have to look. And it's amazing. We're more alike than we are different.
That's amazing. I would love to extend these interviews on to we have to have part 3, part 4, but because there's just so much here. Just for the sake, because we have you here, I'm interested. So do you have any specific sites related to your family that you know of, locations? You said, Tar Adams, he was a gunsmith. Do you know, like, this? You said you knew the street that he might have lived on. Do you know the location of where he might have operated that store out of?
In the history books, it says it was in Canonsburg on Chestnut, west of First. So it would have been West Chestnut. And I have a map in my notebook of the layout of Canonsburg. And I've been in touch with the Washington County Historical Society, and they verified that information. I wish I could find a photo, but they really didn't do photos that much back then. But, I have verification via a written record and historical records that that's where the shop was located.
Well, that's certainly a historical site. We need to put that on the map somehow, get a plaque going. Do you know of any other sites in particular? Do you have anything else pop in your head, like when your family was in Los Amigos or...
Well, Ohio University, that was Los Amigos, but the other Underground Railroad conductor is Pleasant Litchford. And there was a book called Under the Parking Lot that came out, I think it was last year. And there's actually, I actually have a picture, it's on my computer and on my phone, of my cousin Jim, who helped with the information for that. My cousin, Jim Bryant, his mother, Virginia, married into the Bryant family. They own restaurants and hotels that were listed in the Green Book. So Pleasant Litchford is their relative, which by default becomes mine. So there's two Underground Railroad conductors in our family. And I think I sent Barry a clip where they talked about him being a conductor and helping people. And he was working with people in the community and was next door to the Lucy Depp property in Upper Arlington. I think that's Franklin County, out near Columbus. So that's another connection. And I think they're still finding more information out about that.
As that develops, we definitely need to find out if we can identify a specific place where he operated out of and make sure that's saved for future generations.
I think that would be interesting. And as far as Sam Sharp and Wyandotte County, there is a connection going through Marietta, Ohio. And Henry Louis Gates was tracing his own ancestry a few years back. And he was talking, he went to West Virginia, and there's a picture online of a lady interviewing him, and he was talking about looking for his Mayle, M-A-Y-L-E, and Croston ancestors. I thought, those are the same names in my family. And last summer, I went with a cousin to Mount Vernon for her 50th high school reunion. And we went to Cutler in Marietta.
Can I confirm which states are these places in?
Ohio.
Pennsylvania? Ohio? Okay.
Ohio and Pennsylvania.
Okay.
That's it.
Is Mount Vernon in Pennsylvania
It's
or
in Knox County, Ohio.
Okay.
Knox County, Ohio.
Okay.
Marietta is in, I think it's Washington County, Ohio. I think.
Yeah, you're talking to Floridians where.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's right. Okay. Yeah, I think, and I've got to get my map out because we crossed a river and I thought, is this the Ohio River? Did barges go down? I didn't even know barges went down the river. This is how bad at history I am. But we went to Cutler to visit family, went to Mount Vernon, to the museum, saw a lot of information and reconnected with family we hadn't seen in a long time. And it was the same people that Henry Louis Gates was being interviewed by. And my cousin, Reverend Mayo, when I took my grandmother's album to him and said, can you help identify these people in our family? Because he grew up with Sam Sharp. And he said, yeah, these are our Croston and Mayo relatives from West Virginia. So I don't know if Henry Louis Gates is part of my family or not, but everyone's connected in some way at some point. It's just figuring out where that connection is. It's an amazing puzzle.
All right. So stepping back through your childhood, how was slavery and segregation discussed within your family?
It wasn't really discussed. We were the only Black family. I had a rough time in school. My brother played sports. He didn't have a rough time. I graduated from St. Mary's in New Haven from high school. For a while, my brother went to Cheshire Academy. So education was primary. We always went to church. We always had Newsweek, Ebony, Family Circle, Good Housekeeping. I remember those on the table. And we had the newspaper. And so being up to date and aware of news, voting, being supportive in the community through the church was important. And all the family did that. The family is scattered, not just Ohio. Some lived in Maryland, some lived in Washington State, others in Nevada. And now I've got cousins that live in Mexico. So our family is scattered, but everyone has kind of followed the same path, focused on family, staying in touch, and on education, and being active in the political system to try to make things better. Mm-hmm. So that was always very important. That was very important. It wasn't talked about.
Considering that, in your religious life at church, did you find African American community in your church, or did you feel isolated in that sense?
It was where we lived. It was African American churches that we went to. It was either African Methodist Episcopal, AME, or Congregational, or Baptist. When I went to Catholic school, I did take catechism classes, and the nuns told me I didn't have to because I wasn't Catholic, but I thought you can never have too much information. So I like learning. Mm. And I think that's the key to really doing better, making history personal and making it interesting.
Well, I don't want to tire you too much today asking questions.
Yeah.
Would you? Well, I want to talk to Barry. Would you like us to continue? Or?
Sure. So this is you won't be able to answer this question, but I don't know. You referred to one of your enslaved ancestors, an ancestor that was enslaved, and his name was Sabe.
Sabe, right?
S-A-B-E.
S-A-B-E.
So just recently, and it's kind of, I don't know if it's a coincidence or not, but I'm researching a possible connection between another tribe and a freedom seeker who was adopted into the tribe. And the term used for him was Sabe. And it's an Indian term that means black. And there could be some variations between tribes, but it could definitely be a connection there.
Wow, it could be. The Sabe that's in my Cannon family that was in Alabama, I think I brought a copy of I've got a copy of that paperwork with me. I think they originated from South Carolina, which was one of the major slave ports. So it's possible because names were repeated. A lot of times after the Civil War, families would sometimes find their, relatives that had been sold off or escaped. And I think part of that was because the names were repeated, and especially something like Sabe, it's a little bit unique. So it could be. I don't know. I'm intrigued.
I'm intrigued. We need. I see us looking into that more. Definitely, leave no stone unturned.
Absolutely.
We'll let you know what we find.
Yeah.
Well, I think we should close the interview for today, and then I see us doing follow-up interviews in the future for certain. There's so much to learn from you. You've done so much work. I could, we could teach a class on what you found. So thank you so much for speaking with us today.
You're very welcome. I would love to come back. I was in the process of moving to Ohio, so a lot of my original photos and memorabilia is still in Georgia. So a follow-up, I would love to share and have all of that digitized so other people can maybe find something in their own history, in their own family with that.
Well, before we do close up, are there any more photographs or documents that stand out that maybe you want to show us?
Let me see. This is, This is what Sam Sharp looked like. And what's so interesting, this right here is my grandfather, Earl. And it looks a lot like him.
Put them next to each other.
Yeah. And with my original documentations, I have Sam Sharp's business card. I've just got copies of it. I've got copies of his will.
Wasn't he handsome? That's nice.
Yeah. And these were the handwritten notes from my mom's sister telling about her family and who her ancestors were. And I have the same thing for my canon ancestors. And this is actually my dad. He is the baby. My dad is the baby on the lap. And what was really interesting, my Aunt Chloe, who's in the background, this was my dad's family. She said that the house that they bought was a stop on the Underground Railroad. And my grandfather in the 1930s bought the Webster House in Oberlin at 174 West Lorraine. And he and three of the older sons took it apart and moved it to Grafton Road. And so I've been trying to find a picture of that original Webster house because my cousin Marion told me, and some other people have said, well, that was a stop on the Underground Railroad. And she told me at one time that they used to live in that house when it was on Grafton Road before it was torn down. And she said there were a dozen different ways in and out of the house. And when her mom was trying to find her for chores, no one could ever find her. So there is a link between the people that live there and the Websters in Wellington. I've got pictures of, I think, the house, but they're not always real clear. This is my Cannon and Wall cousins. which is my link to the Oberlin Wellington rescue, because the Wall family and my Cannon family are connected through marriage. So these are just some of the old pictures that I have. This is my Aunt Geneva and her dad, who was a Seminole Indian from Florida.
Oh, wow. Do you know anything more about him where in Florida?
I looked up their information, and his name was Archie Hurd. I think I wrote it either on the back or at the bottom, but I've researched that also.
Wow.
It's a lot of, I think all of us, we have a lot of information in our families, a lot of detail. And I met a man who was a reporter for MSNBC years ago when I was fighting a foreclosure in Georgia. And his family was in Germany. And we kind of connected by talking about our family history and research. And so we were able to help each other. It's really interesting. And no matter what your ethnicity, everyone has a family and everyone has a family history. And that's a unifying force. It would be great to have something like this in schools. I think Oberlin has, there was a comic book written about Oberlin. And for a while they passed it out to, I think it was third or fifth grade, I'm not sure, students. I didn't bring my copy with me. But linking history and heritage is a great way to learn not only about your family, but about where you live, how other people live. I just think that is really good. And people that don't have a traditional mom or dad, everyone's still got a family. Everyone grew up someplace. And it's just interesting to find out about the lives of other people. It's important.
I think that's a wonderful message to close on for today. Thank you for speaking with us, and I'm excited to keep learning more from you in the future.
Oh, I can't wait to show you more.
Excellent.